The territorial judge read Nora Vane's name from the paper on the morning of October the 3rd, 1878, and the sound of it in that small room in Harrow Flat was less like a verdict than a door being shut from the other side. She had known it was coming. Eli's brothers had arrived from Denver with a competing deed, and a lawyer who smelled of bay rum and spoke in a voice she associated with men who had never dug anything. They said the original claim was filed incorrectly, that the transfer of title at Eli's death had not been witnessed as required under territorial law, and the judge, a small tired man with ink on his cuffs, agreed. Nora stood very still while the ruling was read. She did not look at the brothers. She looked at the window where the October light came through the yellow glass in the same flat, patient way it always had. Indifferent to everything taking place below it, she had a mule named Fig waiting outside, and a bedroll, and the canvas surveying satchel Eli had used for 11 years in the canyon country. She had the knowledge in her hands and the knowledge in her head, and she did not yet understand what that knowledge was worth. She would not understand it for many months, and by the time she did, the winter of 1878 would have settled its own opinion about whose learning was sound. If you have ever been cast out of something you built with your own two hands, stay with this story. It belongs to you as much as it does to her. Eli Vane had been a surveyor for the Territorial Land Office, a quiet, methodical man who spent more time in the canyon country than most people spent thinking about it. He had a habit of stopping in the middle of any open space and looking at the rock faces around him the way other men looked at a fire, as though the stone were doing something slow and instructive that he did not want to miss. He had come to the canyon country in 1865 as a young man with a transit and a chain and no particular opinion about the land, and the land had given him one over the following decade. He had mapped the Vermilion Ledge country twice over and knew its fractures the way a cobbler knows the creases in a shoe. He kept field books with meticulous care, filling them with measurements and elevation notes and small marginal observations about rock color, mineral seep, root depth, the angle of old erosion channels. He had read everything written about the cliff-dwelling people who had lived in the canyon country centuries before, and where the written record failed, he had read the stone itself, which was a more reliable source. His father had worked iron in Ohio and had told him once, when Eli was still young enough to be told things he would remember his whole life, that iron was a poor heat keeper compared to stone, that iron heated fast and lost it fast, like a man with no patience, and stone heated slow and gave it up slow, like a man who thought before he spoke. Eli had kept that. He had a talent for holding on to things that deserved keeping. In the autumn of 1875, riding a bench trail 4 miles east of what would become Harrow Flat, he had found a crack in the cliff face that ran 12 feet high and 4 feet wide at its base, and when he put his hand to it, the warm air coming out smelled of old smoke, the deep resinous smell of fires that had burned inside stone for generations before anyone now living was born. He wrote it in his field book. Smoke seam, Vermilion Ledge, Sector 4, estimated depth 30 to 40 feet. Prior habitation evident from ceiling deposit, natural updraft through fissure above. He brought Nora to it the following spring, and she stood at the opening with her hand in the warm current and looked back at him and said nothing, because the thing she felt did not require words. Stone holds what you put into it, Eli had told her then. The old ones understood that. They built their fires inside rock, and the rock became the fire, slow and sure, and it did not go out when the wood was spent. He had said it the way he said most things, plainly without ceremony, as though it were merely an observation about the weather. He stood behind her with his hand on the cliff face, and she had felt him calculating something she could not name. the sum of past fires and future cold, and the reliability of stone as a keeper of what it had been given. He died of a chest illness the following January, in the house his brothers would later take. And Nora had sat beside him for 3 days and had not thought, even once, about the crack in the cliff. She thought about it now, riding east on Fig with the satchel across her knees and the October light drying the last green from the cottonwoods along the wash. It took her 4 days to find the seam again. She had not been back since that spring with Eli, and the bench trail was overgrown where the cattle from the Greer grazing allotment had not worn it, and the Vermilion ledge ran for miles in both directions, its face a continuous warm red in the afternoon and cold gray before dawn, giving nothing away. She rode the bench road east for 2 full days and turned back each time at a feature Eli had not described, a dry fall or a talus slope too steep for the trail. And on the 3rd day she stopped at mid-morning and took out the field book and read his entry again. Smoke seam, Sector 4. The language he used for the ledge segment where the red sandstone gave way to a band of finer-grained buff stone before returning to red. And she looked up and found the color change 40 yards ahead of her and turned Fig toward it. Fig found the opening before she did. The mule stopped on the trail and turned his head toward the cliff, ears forward, and Nora looked where he was looking and saw the crack, a dark vertical mark against the red stone precisely at the junction of the red and the buff, and the air coming from it moved the hair at her temple. She got down and put her face to the opening and breathed. The smoke smell was exactly as she remembered it, old and deep and faintly sweet, the accumulation of fires made by people who were dust before her grandmother was born. The ceiling inside was black with it, a dense carbonized deposit that ran back into the dark. She lit the lantern from the satchel and went in. The chamber ran 32 feet back into the rock. The floor was packed earth and old ash. Along the left wall, a low stone partition had been set by the cliff dwellers, mortared with clay that had hardened to near stone itself. The natural fissure above continued up through the rock at an angle, and when she held the lantern flame near it, the flame bent steadily toward the opening, confirming the updraft Eli had noted. The stone was dry. The ceiling was 7 feet high in the center and sloped to 4 at the back wall, enough to stand in the main space and crouch at the rear, which she could manage. The temperature inside was markedly warmer than the October air outside, the same difference as stepping from a shaded porch into a room where a stove had been burning all morning. She sat down on the old partition wall and held the lantern and listened to the silence of rock, which is its own kind of sound, oppressed, living quiet, different from the quiet of open air. And she thought about what Eli had told her about the stone becoming the fire. She thought about 28 nights of winter cold, pressing down on the Vermilion ledge with all its weight, and the rock holding its answer the way it had been holding it since the cliff dwellers' last fire 4 centuries back. Then she began to make a plan. She worked through October and into November, riding into Harrow Flat only for what she could not find or make herself. Clay from the wash below the bench, mixed with dry grass, pressed in layers against the crack's opening and left to cure. She built the seal 3 layers deep, framing a doorway she covered with the mule's spare blanket until she could cut and cure a leather curtain from a hide she had traded 2 of Eli's surveying rods for at the Harrow Flat General Store. The old cliff dweller wall became her interior partition, her work surface, her shelf. She gathered firewood from the cedar breaks on the ledge above and stacked it against the inner left wall, leaving the center of the chamber clear. She made a small stone hearth directly under the fissure, so the smoke rose naturally up the rock chimney without filling the living space. She chiseled a shallow shelf into the left wall at arm's height, where she kept Eli's thermometer and his two best field books and the tin cup she had carried since Colorado. She hung dried yarrow and cedar in bunches from a cedar pole crossbar wedged in a ceiling crack, partly for the smell and partly because the cliff dwellers had done it, and she saw no reason to improve on their instinct. The sandstone above the hearth began to color with heat within the first week, and by the third week she could press her palm flat against the ceiling stone on the far side of the hearth and feel warmth stored there, steady and impersonal, the way a millstone holds the heat of grinding long after the grain is done. Fig stayed in the outer third of the chamber, where the floor widened and the mule's body heat added to what the rock was already holding. Watching Fig stand easy in the outer chamber in the last days of October, unhurried and warm in the dark, Nora had the feeling she sometimes got from Eli's field books when a line of numbers added up to something that looked too clean to be accidental. The feeling that the thing she was doing had been correct from the beginning, was correct in the way that rock is correct, not argued into being but simply present, waiting for someone to recognize it. Walt Greer first called it Vane's Hole in early November, standing outside his feed store with his thumbs in his suspenders and his opinion already formed. He said it to Bess Alcott, who had stopped to buy oats, and Bess reported it to Nora on her next trip to town with the particular careful neutrality of someone delivering news they wished they did not have. Walt had said, and these were his words as Bess gave them, that it was a shame the widow Vane had taken up in a hole in a cliff like a swallow, that a woman of her age and some small education ought to have accepted the boarding house room Bess had offered, rather than burrowing into the Vermilion Ledge like she meant to winter there. He had laughed after he said it. Nora listened to Bess give the report and then said, "I mean to winter there." And Bess looked at her with something between worry and a slow-dawning respect that she did not yet know what to call. Bess's nephew Lem, 14 years old and sleeping in the boarding house storeroom since his parents had gone east for the consumption cure, heard this exchange from behind the woodpile where he was supposed to be splitting kindling. He arrived at the cliff the following morning with his blanket roll and his own 2 hands and asked no permission. Nora set him to work tamping the second clay layer on the south side of the doorway and did not say anything about the boarding house room. The boy was thin and deliberate in his movements, with large hands that already seemed to understand tools better than his age could quite account for, and he worked without complaint in the cold mornings and without commentary on the strangeness of their situation. And Nora found that she valued his silence the same way she valued the silence of stone, as a kind of competence in itself. The work Lem could not yet see was the work that would matter. Nora had been thinking about Eli's field notes since October, and in November she sat down with the satchel and his field books spread open on the partition wall and read every entry about the seam and the adjacent ledge geology. The fissure above the hearth opened into a larger crack system that ran 30 feet up through the rock before exiting at the ledge surface, and Eli had noted that the updraft was strongest in cold weather, when the temperature differential between the warm interior and the cold exterior pulled air up through the rock faster than a stovepipe. The stronger the cold outside, the stronger the draw. The chamber would not merely hold heat, it would, under the conditions of a hard winter, feed itself, the fire pulling harder and burning cleaner as the cold pressed down on the cliff face above. She explained it to Lem one evening in plain words, sitting with the fire drawing well and Fig drowsing in the outer chamber, and the boy listened with the focused patience of someone who works outdoors and understands that things work for reasons whether or not you can name them. "My husband's knowledge came from his father," she said, "who worked iron in Ohio, and from years in this canyon country, learning what the old ones already knew. Stone takes time to warm and time to cool, and what takes time to do it holds the doing longer." She put her hand flat against the ceiling stone above the hearth and held it there, and Lem reached up and did the same, and the warmth came through his palm the way it does when you are not expecting it, sudden and steadying. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "It feels like it means to stay." And she said, "That is exactly what it means to do." The church social in early December was when Walt Greer produced his best material. Harrow Flat's social season was not extensive, but what it had it used thoroughly, and the December gathering at the Methodist Hall brought out most of the canyon settlements within a half-day's ride. Walt stood near the cider table and returned to the theme of Vane's Hole with an audience of 7, and his rendering of it had grown in the telling. The widow Vane, he said, had taken the old cliff-dweller custom a step further and was proposing to outlast the winter in a crack in the rock no wider than a reasonable man's arm span, with a 14-year-old boy and a mule, banking on the warmth of the ancient fires to see her through. He said the last part with the particular tone that men use when they want the absurdity to do the work of argument, and 2 of his audience laughed because it was the easier thing to do. A man named Dodd, who ran the freighting road that passed below the Vermilion Ledge, said he had seen the clay seal, and it looked sound enough to him, and Walt said that clay in a crack was not the same as a proper dwelling, and Dodd said he did not know about that, and the matter settled back into the ambient noise of the social without resolution. If you have heard of Nora Vane and wondered how a woman with nothing more than a dead man's field books came to change the way an entire canyon settlement thought about shelter, then what Walt Greer said at the cider table is your answer, because it was the last time he would say it with any confidence. Bess Alcott, who was present and had said nothing, caught Nora's eye from across the room. Nora was standing near the stove with her hands around her cider cup, and her expression was the same expression she used for weather, patient and without opinion and steady in all directions. At the territorial agent's quarterly visit to Harrow Flat in January, which took place 2 days before the cold arrived in its full character, Walt had occasion to use the phrase one final time. The agent, a man named Sully who came down from Salt Lake to collect returns and file any land use disputes accumulated since September, was making his rounds of the settlement businesses, and Walt stood with him outside the feed store in the mild January air and described the widow's situation in the Vermilion Ledge with the manner of a man explaining a local peculiarity to a visitor. He used the words again, Vane's Hole, and shook his head in the way of someone who finds the persistence of certain people genuinely baffling. Sully wrote nothing in his ledger at that moment. He had a face that gave away less than most, and eyes that moved the way the eyes of men who record things for a living move, taking in more than they appeared to. He said he would have the surveyor look at the occupancy question in the spring. Walt said that seemed sensible. The temperature that afternoon was 31 degrees, which was mild for January in the canyon country, and neither man standing outside that feed store had any reason to believe that within 48 hours the mildness would have become a memory of a different kind. The cold came in earnest on the 22nd of January, 1879. The temperature at dawn was 17 below the 0 mark on Pratt's instrument, and it dropped further as the day progressed, which was not the direction temperatures were supposed to travel. By nightfall, it was 23 below. The sky was a flat white gray that gave no information about what was behind it, and the wind had stopped entirely, which in the canyon country in January is its own variety of warning, the way a river goes quiet before the ice takes it. The cedar trees on the ledge above had begun to make a sound in the extreme cold, a soft, steady ticking as the moisture in their wood contracted in the dark, like a building settling into its foundation after a long day. Lem heard it first, lying awake in the sleeping alcove, and came and told Nora, and she listened for a moment and said, "The cold is speaking to the wood." She said it without alarm, only as an observation, the way you might note the color of an approaching storm and continue with your work. The creek at the base of the Vermilion Ledge groaned once in the night as the last of its running water surrendered to the cold. In the morning, the temperature was 26 below. Inside the alcove, Nora's thermometer read 49 degrees. She fed the morning fire and watched the flame pull up the fissure hard and clean, harder than it had drawn all autumn. The cold outside pressing down through 30 feet of rock and the fire answering it with everything it had. She did not go outside until the afternoon, when she went only far enough to verify what the cliff face above the entrance looked like, and the stone had taken on the deep, saturated color it acquired in extreme cold, a darkening of the red toward brown, as though the canyon were showing what it was made of underneath the pleasanter colors of the milder seasons. She put her hand to the cliff face and felt the cold in it, running all the way to the bone in her palm. And then she went back inside and felt the sealing stone above the hearth, which was warm and dry and certain. And she stood there for a moment with one hand cold and one hand warm. And the fire drew up through the fissure like a long, slow breath. The territorial weather station at the railhead recorded 28 below by the third day, and it did not climb back above zero for 26 more days after that. Walt Greer's water pipe froze on the second morning and split, and he spent the better part of a day trying to thaw it with heated stones before abandoning the effort and moving his family into the back of the feed store, where the stacked grain provided some insulation from the cold, pressing through the board walls. The Dodd family's sod roof, weighted by ice that had formed from the condensation of their own breath, freezing on the underside of the dried grass above, began to show strain by the end of the first week. A steady ticking sound in the roof boards went on for 2 days, and then stopped, which was a worse sound than the ticking had been. The Hollis household, 2 miles south along the bench road, lost their milk cow on day 4. And their youngest child was carried to Bess Alcott's boarding house, wrapped in every cloth piece the family owned. The Alcott boarding house itself was running low on wood by day 9. The families sheltered there were burning furniture by day 11, and the smoke from green wood filled the rooms and settled on the windows and the walls, and the temperature inside fell to 32 degrees, which was the temperature at which water became ice, and which was not warm enough for a child who was not yet a year old. Bess came to the cliff face on the 9th night with the Hollis infant wrapped against her chest and 3 others behind her. And Nora opened the leather curtain and let them in without a word about the room they had offered or the hole they had named. She had kept the fire running all day, and the inner chamber was 53 degrees by the thermometer. And when Bess stepped inside with the child, and the cold dropped away from them both, the sound Bess made was not quite a word, just a small, involuntary sound at the back of the throat. The sound a person makes when something they had stopped expecting arrives anyway. She stacked them around the hearth and set Lem to feeding the fire, and went back out into the 29 below night to help carry what they had brought, which was not enough, but was what they had. Over the following 3 days, 7 more people came down the bench road or across the canyon floor to the crack in the cliff, some guided by Bess, some following the side of Lem's lantern set at the entrance in the early mornings, because Nora had told him to put it there, in case anyone was looking for a point of warmth in the dark. One of them was the freighter Dodd, who arrived with 2 horses and a son, and shook Nora's hand at the entrance in a way that meant he remembered what he had said at the social and understood it to have been the correct position. The outer chamber held the animals. The inner chamber held 11 human beings and the fire and the stone held what the fire gave it and let it go slowly. And the temperature in the inner chamber over the worst 11 days of the cold did not fall below 48 degrees. Outside, on those same days, the temperature did not rise above 15 below. The gap between those two numbers was the measure of everything the community had not believed in. October and November and December, rendered now in plain arithmetic that required no explanation. Nora kept the log in the back pages of Eli's field book: day count, interior reading, fuel consumed, head count, and the column of numbers built itself day by day, the way knowledge builds itself, quietly, at the pace the work demands, without any interest in who is watching. Walt Greer came to the cliff face on the 19th day of the cold. He came alone, on foot, because his horse had been given to the Hollis family on day 6, and he had not asked for it back. His hands were wrapped in cloth strips over his gloves, and the cloth on the right hand had frozen stiff. Nora saw him coming from 20 yards and waited at the entrance without moving. He stopped at the threshold where the warm air moved out through the curtain gap, and the cold held the cliff face around him, and he stood there for a moment with his face turned toward the warmth. The warm air touched his forehead, and his cracked lips, and the ice in his beard began to melt at the nearest edges, a slow drop forming on the left side of his jaw, and the expression on his face was one she had seen before, on people coming in from a hard storm. The expression of a person who has just realized they are not going to have to die from this particular cold. He looked at her then. He looked at the sealed stone around the entrance, the 3 clay layers. The timber lintel Lem had fitted in October. He looked at the warm amber glow coming through the curtain gap and heard the soft sound of the fire drawing up through the fissure above, a low, steady, purposeful sound, like a loom running in another room. He stood for a moment more, and what moved across his face in that moment was not a comfortable thing for a man of his settled opinions to feel. But he was cold enough and honest enough to let it move across him without flinching from it. He said, "I did not know stone could be warm." He said it the way a man says a thing he has just understood to be true, without preparation and without performance, which is the only way such things are worth saying. Nora held the curtain aside and he came in. The cold broke on the 28th day, when the temperature climbed back above 0 for the first time since the 22nd, and the creek at the base of the ledge began to sound again beneath its ice. By then, 9 people had died in the wider settlements of the canyon country, most of them from exposure when their dwellings failed or their fuel ran out, and 31 horses and mules and cattle had been lost to the cold. The 11 people sheltered in Nora's alcove came out whole, with no lasting injury beyond 2 cases of chilled fingers that Bess treated with warmed cloths and good sense. Fig came out of the outer chamber into the February light and shook himself and looked at the canyon in his patient, comprehensive way. And Lem sat down on a rock in the sun and put his head on his knees and rested for a while without speaking. And Nora stood at the entrance with Eli's thermometer in her hand and looked at the vermilion ledge above her, its red stone catching the first real warmth of the turning season, and did not say anything. She did not need to. The cold had said everything that required saying, and the rock had answered it, and there was nothing left to argue about. Horace Pratt filed his report to the Salt Lake Land Office in March, with a supplementary appendix on the thermal properties of sandstone alcoves when properly sealed and vented, and a detailed diagram of the seam's interior based on measurements he had taken during his December and January visits. He named the method in the report by the location, the vein seam shelter principle. He noted that it was not, in the strict sense, an invention, since the cliff-dwelling people of the region had understood it 4 centuries prior, but that its deliberate modern application and the documentation of its performance against measured exterior temperatures represented a contribution to the territorial record worth preserving. The report circulated among the Land Office surveyors and was copied twice in the following year, and Pratt read a condensed version at the Territorial Surveying Society's autumn meeting in Salt Lake, where several engineers who had not been inside a canyon alcove in their lives wrote careful notes in their field books. Two of those engineers returned to their home counties and found their own smoke seams in the adjacent cliff country and built their own sealed chambers, with varying success, because copying a form is not the same as understanding a principle. And the ones who understood the principle built chambers that held, and the ones who only copied the form did not. This distinction, which Eli had understood and Nora had inherited and Lem had learned beside a fire in October, was the real inheritance, the one no deed dispute could transfer and no territorial judge could reassign. Walt Greer brought a side of cured pork to the cliff entrance in February of 1879 and set it down without ceremony. Nora found it when she opened the curtain for the morning air. She accepted it in the same spirit in which it was left. By summer, he had begun sending his hired man to ask questions about the clay mix and the hearth placement, and by autumn, Walt was asking them himself, standing at the entrance with his hat in his hands, and his previous certainty worn off him in the particular gradual way that a hard season wears things, not all at once, not loudly, but completely. He became, in the years that followed, the most energetic advocate for the stone seam principle in the canyon settlement, partly from conviction and partly from the diligence of a man who has been publicly wrong and wishes to put something better in the place of what he said. Nora let him be diligent. It was not her business to manage what a man did with his conscience once he had found it again. She did not gloat over him, and she did not forgive him aloud, and she did not make a ceremony of either choice. She simply continued the work, and let the work be its own kind of statement, which is the only kind worth making. She rebuilt the inner chamber over the summer of 1879, mortaring the old cliff-dweller wall where it had cracked and extending the rear partition to create a sleeping alcove separate from the work and cooking space. Lem helped her, and the boy had grown 4 inches since October, and his hands had the deliberate sureness of someone who had been building from necessity all winter and learning the properties of what he touched. He stayed through the summer and into the following autumn and through the next winter, and by the spring of 1880, it was simply understood by everyone in the canyon settlements, including Lem himself, that he was not going back to the boarding house storeroom. He became, in the years that followed, a stonemason of some regional reputation, building stone-faced shelters along the Vermilion Ledge Road and teaching the clay seal method to younger men who came to him in autumn with nothing but a season ahead of them and the willingness to learn. When people asked him where he had learned to read stone the way he did, he told them about the woman and the cliff and the winter, and about what she had told him one evening beside a fire, about how stone holds what you put into it, and how the understanding of that holding is the thing that cannot be copied off a diagram or learned from a report filed with the land office in Salt Lake. You have to have pressed your palm to the warm ceiling, he told them. You have to have felt the stone answer the fire and understood that the answer was there before you asked it. Then you know what you are working with. Then you know what it has always been willing to do. Nora lived in the vein seam for 11 years, until a persistent stiffness in her hands made the canyon winters more difficult than she wished to negotiate, and she moved then to the stone-walled house below the Vermilion Ledge that Lem had built for her, with walls 2 feet thick and a chimney that drew on the same principle as the fissure above the old hearth. She kept Eli's field books in the house and Pratt's report in the original handwritten copy. Folded in the surveying satchel she kept beside the door, not as evidence of anything but as company, the way you keep a letter from someone you miss even after the words in it have long since been memorized. Fig died in the autumn of 1885, in the outer chamber of the seam where he had spent every winter of his working life, and Nora left him there for a day and then buried him at the base of the cliff in the cedar root soil. She did not replace him with another animal. Some companions are not replaced. Some things you simply carry forward. The crack in the cliff still marks the vermilion ledge. The clay seal Nora built has been maintained and rebuilt across the decades by hands that learned from hands that learned from hers. And the stone inside still carries the black of the cliff dwellers' fires at its ceiling, and Nora's fires above those, a record of warmth laid down in layers the way the canyon laid down its stone, one season pressing against the last, each one keeping something of what came before it. Lem grew old in the canyon country, building shelters along the bench roads and the river breaks, and he trained 3 generations of younger men in the stone seal principle before his hands gave out. And when the last of those men was asked, many years later, where the method came from, he said a woman named Vane had understood what the rock was willing to do if you asked it correctly. He said she had learned it from her husband, who had learned it from his father, who had said that stone was a patient keeper, and that what you gave to stone in patience came back to you in warmth. By then, the Vane seam had sheltered several dozen people through hard winters, most of them not knowing the name of the woman who had first sealed it. Surveyors still noted the opening in their field books when they passed that section of the ledge. Some of them knew the name, and some had forgotten it. And this is the ordinary fate of knowledge, which outlives its maker not by being remembered under a name, but by being used, by being carried in the hands and the judgment of people who understood it from the inside, pressed palm to warm ceiling, fire drawing up through the rock on a cold morning, the stone answering exactly as stone will. What it holds still stands. What it knew was never lost. It only moved, the way warmth moves from the place where it was first made into everything near enough to receive it.